Without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Ben Chorty, who is a lecturer in marine biology at the University of Plymouth. His research focuses on understanding the habitat requirements for juvenile fishes and invertebrates living along our coasts. His work has taken him to systems across the world, including the sea lochs of Scotland, the marshes of Shakespeare Bay in America, the reefs of French Polynesia, and now the fantastic beaches and estuaries in the southwest of the UK. Ben has a PowerPoint presentation to share with us via Zoom. Thank you. I'll hand over to Ben.
Thank you very much, Nigel, for the introduction. Hopefully you can see my first slide now. And yes, thanks for having me tonight and giving me this opportunity to talk about my work on the link between fisheries and habitat conservation, with particular focus on a 3-year study so far of juvenile flatfishes at sandy beaches throughout southwest England. So one thing all of us in the south will be familiar with is that every year, many thousands of visitors and residents flock to our shore. So we're all familiar with this. But there's actually a parallel migration that's happening beneath the waves. Young fish, immature juvenile fish, are moving in from deep waters and coming to use the shallow inshore areas during their first summer. And my work is about finding out what they're doing here, essentially. If we can understand what makes good habitat, we can assure that these areas are monitored and, if necessary, protected. So fish have complex life cycles. The adults, the things we eat and generally see swimming around, produce huge numbers of eggs. Many hundreds of thousands or millions of eggs per individual in some cases. These eggs are often in marine species. They're often produced offshore and they drift around in the water in the plankton, essentially planktonic, and eventually hatch to become larvae, which develop through a number of different feeding stages. So initially they might not feed at all. They might still be relying on those yolk reserves. Then at a given point, they'll begin to take food. They'll gradually undergo a series of very dramatic and rapid changes. And eventually they'll undergo a metamorphosis and turn into the sort of what's called juveniles, which are basically sexually immature small versions of the adults. And the juveniles will gradually grow and join the adult population. Now, one of the key things about this population, this life history, essentially, is that there's overproduction of offspring. Huge numbers of eggs are produced, and then very rapid mortality during early life. So it's very different from human populations and other mammals, where we have a sort of more type 1 style, where most of the mortality is concentrated at the end of the life. In the fishes, most of the mortality is concentrated at the beginning of the life. And this means that the processes that occur during those first few weeks or months critically determine the population size that you end up with. So all the early life stages, the eggs, the larvae, and the juveniles are important in this regard in determining the year class strength. But while the eggs and the larvae, and often the adults, tend to live offshore, it's the juveniles that move into these really shallow inshore areas, which are really close to human activities. So the juvenile stage is really where these really key population processes interact with our human uses of the coastal zone. So the juvenile stage is an important focus for management. So the places that are particularly important for juvenile fish are often termed nurseries. And we often think of those as being these sort of classic vegetated habitats, things like mangroves or seagrass beds or salt marshes. But it's important to remember that young fish also live in places like these, mud flats, sand flats, intertidal areas on beaches, and even in quite human impacted environments like Southampton water. In fact, if you look at the commercially important European fish species, and the figure's a little bit small, I'm aware, but it's actually the case that more of those species use sand and mud as their nursery habitats and for other important functions than the vegetated habitats. Okay, so these two bars here, which you can probably see, represent the soft bottom habitats, both intertidal and the subtidal soft bottom habitats. So these are much, well, in this case, there are more species that use these habitats as nurseries than species that use vegetated habitats like, if I can find my cursor, seagrass over here, or kelp, or salt marsh. A good example of the flatfish. So the flatfish are an important component of the UK fisheries and include some of the highest value species in the industry, things like sole and turbot. 25,000 tonnes of flatfish are landed by UK vessels each year, which amounts to about 8% of total fish and shellfish landings. And 2/3 of those flatfish are from species that rely exclusively on the shallow, sandy areas during their juvenile stages. And when I say shallow areas, I mean areas less than 5 meters deep. So the types of areas that you and all the visitors to this region will be swimming and paddling in when you go to the beach. So it's important to realize that these habitats that we love to visit, these are incredibly important for fisheries production. These are the habitats that go on to generate the fish we need to go and catch and eat. So, as I mentioned, by providing a place for these fish to grow up, these habitats are really important in fueling fisheries production. And actually, there's not all that much legislation to preserve these habitats. The US legislation embraces the function of inshore habitats as fisheries production areas explicitly. So the USA, in the Sustainable Fisheries Act in the USA, was brought in 1996, and basically it says that it's necessary to identify essential fish habitat. Those are defined as waters and substrates necessary to fish for spawning, feeding, or growth to maturity. That threats to essential fish habitat and steps to ameliorate the threats must be identified. In Europe, the situation's a bit different. So we have the Habitat and Water Framework Directive and the Integrated Coastal Zone Management Programme, which has requirements for reliable biological indicators of habitat quality. Okay, so this is mainly focused on nature conservation. We also have the Common Fisheries Policy, which binds member states and the EU Commission to establish what's called fish stock recovery areas. So that is recognizing the role that habitats play in producing fish, but it's not necessarily, I haven't seen too many examples of how that's actually been applied. In the UK now, we have the UK Fisheries Act. And this basically, there's recognition in here of the need for an ecosystem approach to fisheries management. And there are requirements, for example, stating that the MMO may make bylaws relating to the exploitation of sea resources or for the purpose of conserving marine fauna or marine habitat types. Again, the emphasis here is on protecting habitat from damaging effects of fishery. But where's the legislation to ensure that the habitats required by fisheries species or other important conservation fish species are conserved? So that's just a bit of an idea of the legislative background and where we stand with that. So regardless, we need to know for effective management, we need to know the areas that are required by these juvenile fish. So a big part of my work is trying to measure habitat quality for juveniles. I'll just skip over this. But there are many ways we can measure the habitat. One is by the presence or absence of species. Okay, but that or the abundance of those juvenile fish in a particular habitat. But that may not actually be enough. We may have an area which is packed full of fish, but they're simply not growing or surviving in that area. So it's not going to be a very good habitat. So we also need to know something about the growth and survival of the fish. And ultimately, we need to know, the best thing to know is the contribution they make to the adult stock. And so the work that I've been conducting focuses on these first three things, and particularly on flatfish. So let's start with plaice, which is a very well-studied species, and has been a big focus of my research. The adults, this is a flatfish species, probably all familiar with it. This is the adults spawn offshore, the larvae drift around in the plankton, and then the juveniles take residence on shallow areas of sandy beaches, like this one up on the west coast of Scotland, where a good part of my work has been undertaken. And these, probably the maximum density of fish in these habitats is probably at about 1 meter's depth, so sort of hip-high water. And they arrive about the size of postage stamp. They spend the summer migrating around in and out with the tide, feeding on small invertebrates. By the end of the summer, they're about the size of your palm, and then they move offshore and join the adult. They move offshore a bit deeper again. So for many decades, people have been trying to work out what controls the growth of plaice in these habitats. And observations that there's abundant food for these fish in shallow areas led to the suggestion that these fish were growing maximally. They didn't have any trouble getting food, and they were simply, the growth was simply limited by the water temperature. And that was supported by observations of fast growth at several sites throughout Europe. However, other studies at the same time found evidence that these fish weren't growing maximally, and they were either limited by, there was some evidence that actually their growth was density dependent, or basically limited by the number of fish in the site. So fish which had sites which had lots of juvenile fish tended to have slow growth rates, so there's some sort of crowding effect. Or that it was simply relating to prey quality. So how can we reconcile these conflicting observations? So on the one hand, we're finding at some sites, we're finding evidence for fish growing maximally, not being limited by food. At other sites, it seems like other processes are going on. So obviously, since all these studies were undertaken at different locations and at different times, it seems likely that if the factors controlling the growth of fish in these environments vary in space and time, all these studies are going to come up with different answers. So what we actually needed to do was get some better understanding of the patterns of growth variation in space and time, and then try and understand what might be driving it. So in order to do that, I'll just skip over this now. In order to do that, it's quite difficult to measure growth rate in the field. So what we did was we developed a biochemical index of growth rate. So basically, by taking a small piece of tissue and analyzing the composition of nucleic acids in that tissue, we could predict quite well how fast the fish were growing. What that meant was we could go to different sites, we could collect young fish, we could measure the RNA content and work out how fast they were growing. So once we did that, we could start to map out patterns of growth variation in quite a lot of detail. So here we're looking at changes in growth throughout the summer at 7 different sites on the west coast of Scotland in 2 different years. So the x-axis, the bottom axis here is showing time from about mid-July until about mid-September. And as you can see, at almost all these sites, there's a strong decline in growth throughout the summer. And that really helps us to understand a little bit more about this situation, and it helps us understand areas we're coming to different results. Basically, we need to consider what's happening over time. In early summer, we do see evidence for maximum growth, but in late summer, we see evidence for growth limitation. So in a sense, both people were right. They were just looking at different parts of the elephant. But we still wanted to know exactly what might be controlling growth variation. So to address this, we went much broader and we took a snapshot of growth variation up and down the west coast of Scotland in 3 different years. And we found quite substantial growth rate among these different sites, these different beaches. There are sites where fish really weren't growing at all and sites where they're growing at quite a rapid rate. What we then did was try and explain, we tried to correlate that growth variation with environmental variables. And what we found was that the things we expected, things like temperature, place density, and the food availability correlated quite poorly with growth rate. But these physical factors of beaches, things like the wave exposure, the tidal range, seem to do a much better job at explaining growth variation. So we're in a situation where we had lots of unexpected growth variation, large amounts of growth variation at lots of different spatial and temporal scales. It wasn't explained by those traditional explanations relating to food and temperature, but actually the physical conditions were much more important. So that really gets on to what we're now doing down in the southwest. We're trying to understand how physical factors drive variation in the growth of juvenile flatfish. And I've been working with a PhD student, Anna Pearson, who's pictured on the next slide, to try and actually map out how these young flatfish are using these sites. So very little is known about how these habitats, how fish use these, juvenile flatfish use the beaches here in the southwest. So the first thing we needed to look at really was the patterns of abundance of different species. So here you can see we've created maps showing relative abundances at 18 different sites all throughout the southwest. We found a mixture of, it's much less place dominated down here. We found a mixture of place, turbot, sole, and then some other species of flatfish too. And we're now looking, it's a work in progress, we're now looking at how these patterns of variation relate in growth, in abundance, but also growth, how these relate to the physical environment. And the next step, so that's been a 3-year study. The PhD work is just wrapping up now and will be completed soon. Now we're beginning to look into more long-term monitoring at a subset of the sites to try and understand what's driving differences in abundance and growth among years, since this is going to be really important for telling us about variation in these important stocks over time. So this is some work I'm continuing with research students, but also trying to get undergraduates at the University in Plymouth involved each summer to come out and sample the fish. So I think I had a last slide there, but it's disappeared. So thank you all again for coming and listening to me here talk about my work. I think there might be some time for some questions.
Thank you very, very much, Ben. Some time for some questions now. First question from Keith. If you'd like to ask the question yourself, please feel free. Just unmute yourself.
I've unmuted myself. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, Keith.
Right. Well, this is all to do with Brexit and whether EU regulations and so on actually apply now, particularly the one which is to do with fish recovery areas. Is it now irrelevant?
I guess it would be now subsumed under the Fisheries Act. So I guess, but the point of mentioning that was really just to highlight some of the legislation that exists not only in this country but elsewhere. So the United States, for example, is the best example I can think of essential fish habitat legislation. So I included that.
Yeah, I think that fish recovery areas might fall under the Benyon review of highly protected marine areas, where again this magic 30%, which comes from Callum Roberts mainly, pops up. But as far as EU regulation is concerned, they're not necessarily out the window. Things like the Habitats Directive and condition assessments and so on are still going on. But I think as far as fish recovery areas are concerned, I don't see any action. I haven't seen any action have you seen any action at all by the British government in the last, say, 7 years, 8 years?
No, and thank you for clarifying that as well. And I haven't. No, I haven't looked into it much, have to say. But I did. There was something about a cod recovery area. I think I did see something, but I'm not familiar with much. So I know there has been talk about it, but from my impression, not much has materialised.
I think you're right. I think there are recovery areas for specific species, and particularly areas which are known as nursery areas. But it's something which has perhaps happened with regard to banning, for instance, mobile fishing gear. Yes, there have already been some what you might call fish recovery areas, which are really sort of protecting things like nursery areas or overfished species.
Well, there's the Bassick nursery area is a good example, which Tom will be talking about later, I think. But obviously those didn't come under the under any fish stock recovery area legislation. That was a specific action that came in relating to the management of that fishery. And then there's things like the place box down in the Netherlands, for example. But again, that was to do with, I think that was to do with discarding and to prevent the capture of undersized fish, not necessarily for the purposes of protecting nursery areas. And that again came in prior to, it wasn't related to the fish stock recovery areas from what I know.
Tom will be authoritative, so let's leave it to Tom. Thank you very much.
Benjamin, very interesting. Thank you very much. To what extent are your findings with regard to density affected by the amount of fishing taking place in the areas you've surveyed?
So these are related. So the densities that we're looking at are the densities of the juveniles in the nurseries themselves, and these are not fished commercially, although there will be smaller operations, seine netting sometimes in some of these places.
But presumably the adults which lay which generate the new generation are themselves subject to density, I imagine.
Yes, yeah, potentially there could be density dependent processes operating with the adults. It's not really something we've looked at in terms of relating the growth rates of the juveniles with the densities of the adults. But yeah, I mean, one thing it would be useful to get a better idea about how the densities around the coast relate to the abundances that we see, because you know part of it might be due to the quality of the beach itself and the physical conditions.
Yeah.
A lot of it might simply be due to the fact that, you know, where do they spawn and where do the young end up? That's going to have a big impact on what's happening.
Right. Okay.
So hopefully if we can continue this over time, continue these surveys over a longer period, we'll get an idea of how variations in abundance among years relate to changes in the size of the stock. But at the moment, we don't have really the ability to separate that out with the spatial sampling.
Thank you. We have now a question from Jem Clear. Jem, if you can.
Okay, yeah. So can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. You commented in particular that you found good correlations between certain physical features of the estuaries and the coastal waters that you were looking at, like, was it tide height or the tide, so wave height, tide reach, temperature, and so on. Of course, particularly in the Salcombe estuary where we are, there's issues over human effects, disturbance of the water, pollutants. Have you got any data on those factors which might be affecting your juveniles and your growth rates?
Not with the flatfish. It was something that we're interested in looking at some point. We've been addressing that more with other species of surf zone fish and weaver fish in particular, because obviously there's a really important human fish interaction there. So yeah, it is something that we'll be able to look at using estimates of, well, particularly we'll be able to look at potentially the impact of human presence and disturbance, direct human disturbance on things using those data. I was kind of interested to see how things would be. We managed to get out sampling this year, and I was kind of interested to see how things were in this year, where they're a very different year from normal. But I was expecting, what's going to happen when there are no people on the beaches, but actually it was probably the opposite. We actually, it's quite crowded when we went out in the summer. So yeah, that's something that people haven't really looked at all that much in relation, but you'd think it would have a big effect because there are lots of people on these beaches and they're not in very deep water. The fish are not in deep water.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Robert Price.
Yeah, thanks, Nigel. Really interesting, Benjamin. And my question was very similar to Jen's, actually, but rather than the human disturbance, I just wondered if you've been looking at any of the natural physical processes and the impact on the juveniles. So things like, longshore drift, particularly perhaps some of the more exposed areas that sort of are more affected by those kinds of natural physical processes.
I mean, the ones we've been looking at so far are the key drivers of kind of the beach state, as it were. So things like the wave heights, sediment particle sizes, tidal ranges, and things like that. Are you talking about smaller scale processes, surf zone, rip currents and?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So that's something I'm quite interested in. So the work up in Scotland, and we found 100-meter scale variation in growth rates of these young fish, and there's actually very high variation in the diet as well of these young fish as you move along the shore. We also so there are big differences at very small scales. So we look at the beach and we think, oh, it's just sandy beach, but actually it's quite structured, and prey can be very patchy and the physical environment can be very patchy. So something we did look into up in Scotland, and we've done some preliminary work in Cornwall, sampling fish at quite small scales and flying drones to look at surf zone processes and seeing how things are related to the surf zone characteristics. So yeah, rips, bars, and things like that. Quite challenging to do, and that's definitely something I'm keen to. I'm currently looking for some PhD funding to carry on this work, and that's a big part of it, because those could be really important.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Question from Doug Hurtson.
Unmuting. Right. Yeah. How far away from these nursery beaches are the spawning areas? Would the density of the juveniles on the beach be related to the distance of the beach from a spawning area? And how actually do they find the nursery beaches? Does it depend on the currents, or is there some inbuilt migration sense?
Yeah, very good. Thanks, Doug, for the great questions. So one of the reasons for you'll have seen we've been sampling these beaches from all around the southwest, really. So we've been sampling in North Cornwall, South Cornwall, and Devon as well. So quite a large area. And we've tried to sort of, as much as possible, replicate these different beach types within each of those regions. So we're also not just looking at the physical characteristics, we're trying to understand the regional variation and how that might vary and whether that might tie up with potential spawning areas. I don't think we have a brilliant idea of where all the spawning areas are, but it would be, I mean, we talk about a spawning area off Trevose Head, We know that the English Channel, the Eastern English Channel, is important for place. We did see a high abundance in the year we had the beast from the east, so there. But yeah, it would be really interesting to do some particle tracking type work, looking at the physical oceanography and trying to understand, potentially the pathways where fish are spawning and where they might be ending up. Sorry, what was the second part of the question was about the
does it depend on the currents in the area, whether the larvae are carried from spawning areas to the nursery areas? Would it mean there'd be a perfectly acceptable beach, but the currents never take the larvae to it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So you're kind of, part of it's going to be driven by actually the characteristics of the beach, and part of it's going to be driven by the larval supply. But if you see two adjacent beaches with very different physical characteristics and they have different assemblages of the flatfish, then hopefully you can sort of pick apart some of those things. How they actually get to the beach, I don't think the actual cues they're using are necessarily known, but they certainly, it's thought that the vertical migration is really important for enabling them to get where they need to go. So there was a study in the Irish Sea where they looked at, they looked at what would happen if you sort of let these larvae just drift around randomly, and what would happen if you gave them a sort of migration behavior where they were migrating up and down to make use of tidal currents. And they found that, when you gave them that migration behavior, they all ended up in the nurseries. So there's likely to be some sort of clever use of current patterns that enable them to move inshore.
Similar to what the adults have been shown to do in the North Sea.
Yeah.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions for Ben at all, please? John Horn. John, you need to unmute.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Good. Okay. I'd just like to take my mind back to several years ago when I used to dive on the Estuaries bank. And at that time, there were huge numbers of very large plaice that were feeding on mussel grounds there. I have no idea now what the situation is because I'm no longer involved. But there were such huge numbers of plaice. I just wondered whether, in fact, that resulted in many of these juveniles actually being taken into the dart rather than anywhere else, because the currents around that area will, in fact, sort of restrict, one would have thought, the way in which these larvae and juveniles actually move. I know for a fact now that within Bigbury Bay, the numbers of plaice are very many fewer, although it's quite encouraging to see that there are more. But the Estuaries bank, to me, was such a dramatic situation. I just wonder whether Ben actually can tell us how things are there now.
No, sorry, I'm not in great detail. I'm not sure how the situation is, particularly in the Estuaries bank. I know it is known as an important flatfish area, particularly for plaice. But yeah, I'm not sure. I haven't got a good idea of how things have changed, particularly in that one location over time.
But it's not very far from us, is it? It's just along the coast. Yet, in that area, there were huge plaice and many plaice as well. Yet, further along the coast in our bay, the numbers are very few. Yet, so close by.
Mm-hmm.
3 years ago, I went on a fishing expedition to the Estuaries bank. I think it was probably in July, maybe too late, and nobody caught a single plaice. Although we were promised there would be plenty, there were none. I think one person out of 12 caught one fish and it wasn't a place.
No, there's an answer, I guess.
That answers it, doesn't it?
Yes. Okay, well, thank you very, very much, Ben.
Thank you all.
I'm now introduce Dr. Tom Stamp, newly doctor. Sorry, I'm just going to find my blurb. Right. Tom has just finished his PhD working mainly on how European bass move within and use habitats within estuaries. And since June last year, he's been working as a researcher for the University of Plymouth, managing their continuing estuarine bass work, but also as a research project to track the movement of brown crab, lobsters, and of course bass at an offshore mussel farm near Sidmouth. So with that, I will pass on to Tom. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nigel. Thanks. I'll just share my screen. Is that okay with everyone? Can everyone see that? Yeah. Okay, yeah, so thanks for the introduction, Nigel. So yeah, my name is Tom Stamp. I work for the University of Plymouth, and I'm just going to give you a quick presentation today on some of the work we've been doing over the past few years in collaboration with Devon and Severn IFCA, where we've been tracking school bass, the schoolies, within Salcombe Harbour and a number of other estuaries along the sort of southwest coastline. Okay. So for those of you who haven't seen them before, this is what bass looks like. You can sort of catch them in estuaries, shallow bays, but also rocky reefs off the sort of south coast of the UK. And in the UK, and in particular in Devon, they represent a really valuable fishery. So for commercial fishermen alone, this species is worth about 5 to 6 million per year at first sale. And there's also quite a significant recreational fishery for them. And there's even specific clubs set up to monitor, to catch bass, basically. So they're really, really important. And but in around 2010, the population across the North Atlantic started declining quite dramatically. And in 2015, it fell below a point where it's thought that the ability of the population to recover was in real sort of danger. And that's led to quite a lot of management and research attention to try and help recover the stock. Now, one of the sort of complications with helping that recovery effort is that bass display quite an interesting behaviour in that they move very locally. So bass have a home, like an individual fish will have a home and will live within around sort of like a 10-kilometre area of seabed. Estuaries and sort of coastal bays are thought to be really, really important nursery areas, which when the fish first occupy these sort of particular sites, so when a fish first occupies, say, Salcombe Harbour, it's thought that that one particular place can be really, really important for that fish for the first sort of 4 to 7 years of its life. And that means that those fish that live in that area are really, really dependent on that environment being a healthy ecosystem to help them grow and develop and eventually like recruit into the adult population. So in this sort of backdrop of the decline of bass across the North Atlantic, the Devon and Severn IFCA were really interested to look at whether sort of bass within Devon were did live within Devon, and sort of looking to how resident the fish were to particular protected sites, which are known as designated bass nursery areas. So we set up the project about 2 years ago, where we aim to sort of track the movement of a number of bass across a number of different coastal sites around Devon, and we were really trying to look at how much time these juvenile bass were spending within inshore areas, which are designated as protected bass nursery areas, looking at sort of what sort of habitats were important for these fish, and then just sort of generally to sort of describe their sort of movement characteristics. So just look at how local these fish really were to Devon. We did that using a method called acoustic telemetry, which basically involves, we recruited a number of sort of recreational anglers. They went out and caught the fish for us. And we then implanted tags inside the body of the fish, which is this sort of middle picture here. and the tag just sort of sits in the body cavity of the fish, and each tag emits a unique signal every 90 seconds, which we can detect by placing these sort of receivers out in the coastline. Each time the receiver detects a tag, it will log the time and date that each individual fish was detected. So by putting receivers within these sort of coastal sites, we put them in sort of lines of receivers. So whenever the fish sort of swam over a line of receivers, we would know the time and date that each individual fish made that movement. And by sort of connecting the dots between these different receivers, we can make a sort of picture of how these fish behave within these inshore areas. So initially we started targeting just 3 sites. So we had Salcombe Harbour, the Dart Estuary, and the Tortorage. But the project is ongoing. We've now expanded, and we've got we tagged fish in the Exe and the Tean Estuary this year, and we've got receivers spread out across most of the estuaries in sort of South Devon. We've also got some at Lundy. We've got, as Nigel said, we've got some receivers at an offshore mussel farm, and then at like sort of a well-known bass wreck within Lyme Bay. Okay, so I'm just going to go into some of the results that we've got so far. Okay, so I'm just going to sort of focus. The project work is ongoing, and we've got quite a lot of data from 3 locations. That's Salcombe, the Tortorage, and the Dart. And the results that I'm going to present now are just really from those 3 sites. So one of the first things we knew about the place that we were tagging the fish is that they do vary quite a lot in their sort of hydrology, and the actual environment is quite different. And so Salcombe Harbour, for example, is a rear system, and not a lot of fresh water flows into that harbour, and that could have quite a fundamental impact on how these fish behave. So with our tracking system, we put water temperature loggers out, and we found that there's quite a distinct difference between, say, Salcombe Harbour and the estuaries. And so this here is a year's worth of temperature data from Salcombe and the 2 estuaries that we were monitoring at the time. And you can see that sort of in the summer, the water temperature in Salcombe is a bit lower than it is in the estuaries. But then when you start to get to around October, November time, the water temperature starts to diverge. And then by the time you get to the middle of the winter, the water temperature in the harbour itself is about 3 degrees warmer than you would get in other sort of surrounding estuaries. And, you know, when you think about the Dart Estuary, is only, what's that, like 20 kilometers down the coastline, and there's this quite big difference in the water temperature between these sites. And as I'll show you in a second, this had quite a fundamental impact on how these fish behave within these places, basically. Okay, so this is the sort of raw output that we get from our tracking equipment. And basically on the right, you can see what's called an abacus plot. And so each row represents an individual fish. Whenever a fish was detected, we get a little point on this graph, and it's ordered by time. So we've got about 2 years of tracking data here. And so the fish are color coded by the particular site. So all the fish tagged in the Dart Estuary are blue, Salcombe Harbour is green, and in the Tortorage it's orange. And then each panel is just showing you whenever those fish were detected across any of the receivers within that particular site. So over the 2 years, we redetected the fish that we tagged about 5 million times, which is a huge amount of data to get from one of these surveys, and it was really, really successful. And we started getting these really, really interesting behaviours about how these fish behaved and how it varied between the individual sites we were monitoring. So if you look at the sort of middle plot from Salcombe Harbour, you can see that actually for a lot of these individual fish, they were present actually throughout most of the year. When you compare that to, say, the Dart Estuary, you can see there's big gaps in the winter when the fish are basically absent. We sort of estimated from our tracking data that really in places like Salcombe, the fish can be either within Salcombe or within an area around sort of 3 to 4 kilometres outside of the harbour for about 75% of the year. Which really sort of highlights that, you know, the fish that are in Salcombe are really there for a lot of the year, and they're really dependent on that harbour being in a really good condition and have availability to a number of habitats that they can feed in. you know, we also looked at what sort of environmental variables correlated with whether the fish were there or weren't there, and we looked at things like whether it was day versus night, the sort of tide heights, whether you had a spring tidal cycle or a neap tidal cycle, and we looked at water temperature, and really all of these variables did correlate with the fish, but water temperature was the real key driver for what these fish were doing in that particular location. And so it really just shows that the individual characteristics of the particular site have a big impact on how these fish behave. And so places like Salcombe Harbour, where we don't necessarily get a lot of fresh water coming in, like a number of the sort of natural harbours along the south coast, might be really important for bass, particularly in the winter. And really interestingly, if you look at the Salcombe Harbour plot, you can see that a lot of the fish from the Dart Estuary did actually move into the Salcombe Harbour. And in particular, you can look at during the sort of winter period, you had some fish moving from the Dart Estuary into Salcombe Harbour, and they were there for maybe 1 or 2 months. And quite a lot of the fish actually did this behaviour, which sort of suggests that, you know, because the water is warmer within the harbour and there might still be a food source there for them, the harbour itself might represent a really, really quite important habitat for these fish. Yeah. So also just important to note that while the fish do stay local for a large amount of the year, they also do move really, really widely. And we've had, in every estuary that we've tagged fish, we've had fish moving between. So we tagged fish in the X and the Teen, and about 4 days later, we picked it up in the Dart Estuary, and then about another day later, we picked it up in Salcombe Harbour. We've also had fish moving from the X and the Teen round to the Plym, where we've got receivers now. And really amazingly, we've also had fish moving from the Dart Estuary into Salcombe, and then making this really big movement around the southwest peninsula into the Tortorridge. And then they've been detected by another research group working in Wales, in Swansea Bay, and then even as far as Pembrokeshire. And that single track that we've tracked that fish is just under 600 kilometres. And we've had fish making the movement from, say, Salcombe Harbour around to the Tortorridge, which takes them about a month, and then moving back again. And so even though these fish do stay very local to the particular location that you might catch one in, they are also connected to the sort of wider marine environment. It's just really interesting to see how these individual fish are making these different behaviours, and it doesn't necessarily marry up with what you might expect. So, you know, quite often, quite a lot of the small fish are the ones making these big journeys around the coastline, and they're doing it at times of the year, like in the winter, basically, when you might not expect them to be moving further north. Okay, and so why does it matter that we're tracking these fish? Why is it important that we know how these fish are moving? So one of the key things that we found is that the fish do live in these very discrete, small areas for a very significant amount of the year. And the management for European bass, they basically assume that there's one population across the whole North Atlantic, which is an area of around 600,000 kilometers squared. And we've shown that the fish actually do exist in these very, very discrete areas, which means that, you know, the story might be a lot more complicated than is currently like factored into when they sort of make up these management plans for bass. And it's not just us that have found this. There's been a few other telemetry studies published recently in the last few years, which have suggested that bass do live very, very, very locally to particular locations, and that maybe the management of these fish need to be reassessed to sort of incorporate this sort of fine scale population structure, which it might be present all around the coastline. We also think that places like Salcombe Harbour may be really important nursery and feeding habitat for these fish, because the fish do stay very local to Salcombe Harbour, and they stay more local in Salcombe than they do the other estuaries. So it's it's really, really, really interesting work. So moving forward, we've just found out that we've just won a bit more money, and we're going to be continuing this tracking work into the future. And we're going to be targeting bass, but also species like pollock and also crawfish, to look at what sort of habitats are important for these fish more widely within the coastline, and look at how connected the estuaries are to these sort of other sort of marine habitats. That's really it. But if anyone's got any sort of questions that they'd like to ask me, then by all means, go ahead.
Thank you very much for that, Tom. That was great. Question from another Nigel. Nigel, shall I read out it for you? What is the typical
sorry,
life?
Nigel, yeah.
Okay, no worries.
No, I was just wondering what is the typical lifespan of a sea bass?
So they can actually live quite long. So we've taken scales off bass, and we've recorded like 20-year-old fish, which is really long for a fish. And they're really slow growing as well, so it can take them about 4 to 7 years to reach sexual maturity, which again is really slow for a fish.
That's interesting, because I noticed earlier that you said the initial or the first 4 to 7 years, and that made me think. So it is quite a long lifespan. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bob Earl?
Thomas, thank you very much for that. I've actually got quite a few questions, but let me kind of deal with the first one. Bass are an astonishingly valuable fish to anglers, aren't they? Hugely more valuable than many other species. They're a kind of lifeline of kind of party boat fishermen. And yet some of the regulations affecting bass have, of course, been rather, how should we say, sweeping, and seriously affected the income of people who take boats out with tourists to fish just for bass. So have your studies actually pointed towards, let's say, slightly more subtle management approaches that might be adopted for, say, tag and release, or local fisheries, where in fact you might people might be encouraged to go on the basis that the fish will be returned, and so on and so forth. Because I mean, the other thing that lurks in the background of this horror story of the trawl bassing, or the paired trawling for bass in the English Channel on a scale which is fairly colossal and seems to happen every year and catches a lot of other species. So that's a kind of fairly wide-ranging set of observations. But I mean, I wonder if anything that you've done reflects on that and might provide some insights in how we might manage bass more effectively.
So the main sort of research, the main sort of outcomes from our project is just sort of showed just how local these fish are, and certainly things like the pair trawl fishery, where they were targeting sort of bass when they were reproducing, they were spawning off the sort of in the sort of western approaches. Is that what you're referring to? Yeah. I think that is an extremely damaging practice that has gone on. But the main sort of results that we've found is that they just are very local, and when you can't really just assume that there's just one population across the whole North Atlantic, you really need to think about what the local fish population might be. In regard to the sort of recreational management which is being imposed, I think that has had quite a big impact on sort of charter boats in the area, I believe though that there's some research came out recently about the sort of actual impacts of how damaging those recreational fisheries aren't, and I believe that's changed recently, hasn't it? The sort of the limits that were put on recreational fishermen has been sort of
they've been up
for review, isn't it?
Yeah. And I wonder, because they catch and can I ask you a question about your? When I was doing my PhD, the animals suffered rather badly from the invasive technique I used to record their heart rates. So your bass recover perfectly from having a transponder or having a tag stuck in them, do they?
Yeah, well, that's one of the as far as we can tell, we've had a 95% success rate on our tagging. But you can never really tell what these fish are doing when they're released on the water. But when we put the transmitter inside the fish, it is an operation. So we anaesthetize the fish, and then we monitor them afterwards when the tag's gone in. And as far as we can tell, the fish are behaving. And certainly when we've tracked these sort of long range movements, it sort of leads us to suggest that at least a significant proportion of the fish are behaving reasonably. normally, but you never really can know with these types of things.
Thank you. A question from Phil Smith, please.
Oh, hi, Thomas. That was a very interesting talk. Thank you. I've worked a lot on the Hale estuary down in Cornwall, and there's some important bass areas there. I don't know if you know the Hale at all, but there's two old Victorian sluicing pools, and one in particular has no fresh water input and is fed basically by full-strength seawater, very sheltered. It's a brilliant area for bass and juvenile sort of nursery area for bass and grey mullet and so on. And I just wondered if you had any plans to extend your survey work to the Hale estuary, because presumably it might be a stopping off stopping off location as bass are moving around from the south coast to the north coast, or vice versa.
Yeah, so this new project that we're trying to set up at the moment, the idea is that we will be working with the Cornwall IFCA, and we haven't yet decided where the equipment will go and where we'll be tagging the fish, but we certainly are going to be trying to suggest these sort of key areas where we think there might be like bass hotspots, basically.
Right.
Yeah, and the Hale estuary might be one of those locations, but we haven't confirmed anything yet, and that's still all up for discussion, really.
Yeah, we had just very quickly on the same point almost. Time to time, people suggest having a tidal, basically generating some tidal energy from the emptying of these Victorian sluicing pools. But in my opinion, that would be really bad, really bad for fish, because I think they're using them on a pretty much tidal basis. They're going in and out quite regularly. So it's somebody contacted us recently, and they're going to do an engineering student's going to do some calculations on impacts on fish. But I would have thought they'll get a lot of bass shredded if they put in a tidal turbine somewhere like that. But I don't know if that's actually on the cards, or whether it's just an idea that's not gone away yet. Really.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think you get a lot of the sort of young of the year bass certainly using areas like that. I think I know the area you mean. You see it on the main road as you drive into St Ives. Yeah. I think you definitely would get a lot of young of the year bass and a lot of mullet moving into those sort of areas. So I think they'd have to think carefully about sort of fish avoidance schemes, or allowing bypasses for fish to get through, basically. But yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Question now from Jem Clear, please.
Hi, Thomas. I'm a complete layman in this. I'm beginning to get the view here of a lot of postdoctoral students of marine biology on the screen in front of me. But in fact, I don't do any angling either, but I am interested. I eat bass and enjoy it. You started off your presentation pointing out that according to the official statistics for the whole of the North Atlantic, the stocks are down at worryingly low levels. And then you present your own data based on much more localized work in estuaries, which seems to show that actually they're doing fine, they're great, and you're loving it. Have you any comment about why the official industry thinks that the stocks are in serious decline?
Well, there's a number of things. There might be that where the surveys might not be representative of what the actual population is doing. So where these surveys are taking place might not be the full picture. So certainly when you go speak to a lot of fishermen within these sort of estuaries, there's always talk about how there's a lot of bass and there's a lot of fish there. Yeah, so it just might be that just the story is just a lot more complicated than is actually being factored within these sort of assessments. But it also just might be that we've shown that we've just looked at how the fish move, but relative to historic levels, we don't actually know how many fish there could be in these environments. So it's kind of, do you know what I mean? It's quite difficult to say, but.
Are you suggesting then that actually they might simply be wrong, and that the bass stocks are actually fine, but it just because of the vagaries of the way they sample and the statistics and all the rest of it, it just looks bad?
That could be, but the stock could also be in real danger, and it could just be that when people look in the estuaries and they see a lot of fish, a lot of these are young fish at the moment, and so it could just be that the stock is in a bad way, and we just can't detect it, or we can't see it. But I'd be inclined to believe the assessment, because it's better to believe something's bad and act appropriately than just assume that it's wrong and like overfish, if you know what I mean. So, but in my opinion, that's the better way is looking at it in the worst case scenario.
Thank you. Question now, please, from Peter Davies.
Hi, Tom. A great talk, and also to Ben. I was just wondering if you could give us an idea of the sort of fine scale movements that the bass were exhibiting within the estuaries. So, for example, I noticed that your most sort of upstream receiver in Salcombe Estuary was somewhere that was very, very tidal and would have entirely dried out at low tide. Did you get lots of individuals using those sort of upper reaches of the estuary, or were they the ones you released in the sort of lower estuary, were they mainly confined to that area? Do you see sort of tidal fluxes that they exhibited, or anything like that?
Yeah, so it's just like, it's quite a complex picture at the moment, but what you would tend to find is that just particular individuals would go up into those high reaches, and I think if I share my screen, I can show. I've actually got a map of where the fish were sort of active.
That's exactly what I was after, so now I can go there.
Yeah, this is what I was frightened of.
So
they've got nothing to worry about from me, Nigel.
So basically, a lot of the fish that we tagged were. This is a sort of heat map, and so the more intense the color, the more purple the color, the more activity you'd get. Basically, we found that actually the majority of the fish were most active down at the sort of mouth of the estuary. And if you look at the sort of Admiralty charts, there is actually a reef at the entrance of this harbour called Bass Rock, which so you don't really need to go through this tracking exercise to really find these sort of answers. But there certainly was particular individuals that would move all the way up into the high reaches of the harbour. And we see that in pretty much every estuary that we've monitored now, that you get a lot of activity around the sort of mouth of the harbour, but you do also get, individuals moving like actually quite big distances on a single tide. So in the Tortorage, we had quite a few individuals moving. I don't know if anyone's familiar with it, but from sort of Appledore all the way up to Weir Gifford, which is sort of several miles upstream. So yeah, the fish do use the whole system, but there's certainly most of the activities to generally around the sort of more marine end of the harbour, basically.
And you're saying that there are certain individuals that are showing this repeated movement into those upper parts of the estuary. It's almost like they have a foraging route that they stick to as opposed to others.
Yeah. We've looked at, we tried to look at if that relates to the sort of size of the animals, and it just doesn't. It just seems that some individuals have certain behaviours where they just go further up into the estuaries than others, and at the moment we can't really explain why that is. There just does seem to be some individuals that are just more roaming than others, basically.
Very interesting. Thank you, Tom.
Interesting maps there, Tom. The hotspots weren't a million miles away from the main common seagrass areas, but interestingly, they didn't seem to use the dwarf seagrass areas at all.
Yeah, with this sort of, I wouldn't. It just sort of gives a rough idea of where the fish were but they might be using it because the dwarf seagrass where's that? Is that near? That's further up, isn't it? Near the,
yes, yeah. West of Saltstone, if that means anything to you.
Yeah. So it just sort of gives a sort of rough idea, as I say. And if we were to really try and look at like if the fish were using particular areas more, we'd have to put more receivers into those particular places, basically. But it just gives a rough idea of the sort of general areas where the fish are more active.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I can see Bob Earl, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, Thomas, it's really good talk. But lots of questions, and I was just one simple question, really, might be simple to me. The offshore mussel rafts are quite interesting from a whole series of reasons. I just wonder whether you could tell us the story about how bass might be using those, and because in essence, we all know about sort of artificial reefs or fish attraction devices, call them what you will, but it'd be rather interesting to get your take on how you've seen the bass that you've recorded use them. Yeah,
so for those of you who aren't aware, there's a big mussel farm off Sidmouth, and it's one of the largest ones in the UK. And we've been monitoring it at Plymouth Uni to look at the sort of positive effects of having such a farm in the area. And we've had receivers out of the farm now since the summer, and so because of COVID and the effects of Brexit affecting how the farmers work, we haven't actually been able to check those receivers yet. So we don't actually know the answer to that question, but we did leave a few receivers at the farm over the winter. And when we went to go deploy the main lump of receivers, we went and downloaded those receivers and redistributed them. And fascinatingly, over that period, we have actually detected bass from Salcombe and the Dart move over to that farm over multiple periods, basically. And we think that the farm itself attracts a lot of smaller bait fish like scad. And we think that they might be acting as a food source for the fish. And I certainly know that bass fishermen, commercial bass fishermen, do go to the farm to catch live bait, to go use it to catch bass. But when we went to go and try and tag some bass at the farm, and we've actually found it quite difficult to catch them. So I think at the moment there are fish using that farm, but I don't think it's in the sort of big quantities. Basically, the fishermen themselves said that if it was that productive and that there was that many sort of big predatory fish there, you would have commercial fishermen fishing there quite regularly, and at the moment you don't see that. So I think at the moment you'll get fish every now and again moving over there and feeding, but I don't think they'll be there like on a long-term basis, basically, at the moment. But who knows, like it might change as the farm develops more.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Are there any other questions for Tom, please?
I've got another one.
Go ahead, Bob.
I mean, you've obviously now this is going back into kind of traditional ecology. When I was at Manchester, there were lots of people doing mark recapture studies on birds in woods and using various things like that. So, is there any point at which you'll have enough acoustic tags in your fish to tell us what the population of animals in, to do a mark recapture study in relation to animals in the South Devon, say?
So would we be able to use the acoustic data to work out sort of population estimates, that kind of thing? Is that what you mean? Yeah. So I've thought about this quite a lot, and I think it's quite difficult to do that kind of study with fish because it's not as easy to see them or to catch them. And so I think from my understanding is those studies rely on you tagging a bunch of animals, releasing them, and then going out and trying to catch them again and recording how many are tagged and how many aren't. I think we could do that, but I just think it would be quite difficult to do at scale, especially with the tags being about 250 pounds each.
Perfect answer. The answer is no.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Although I was going to say that, have you ever felt inclined to catch more bass in Salcombe? Just to sort of see just to keep the kind of population marked fish actually, or tagged fish actually, to a level which is going to help you.
Well, with the numbers that we've tagged, even though it is going to be a very, very small percentage of the actual numbers of fish that are actually in the estuary, we hope that the behaviour that we're monitoring is representative of that wider population. And so I think if our aim was to try and work out how many fish were actually in the estuary, or in the harbour, sorry, I think we would probably go about it a different way. I think we try and use cheaper tags and cheaper telemetry methods, and it sort of answers a different question, if you know what I mean. So that these tags are more a movement thing, and those sort of market capture ones are more cheaper and easier to get out, basically. But that would definitely be something that would be interesting to do.
Thank you.
There's a question from Phil Smith asking, can you estimate the adult mortality from your data at all?
No, I don't think we can. I think you can see in certain instances where you see suddenly just a lot of fish disappear, and like in the tortoise, we just had a big group of them just disappeared quite quickly, and we think that was to do with maybe some sort of netting activity within the estuary. But I think, as far as I'm aware, I don't know how we would do that.
Are there any further questions? Okay, well, can I thank both Ben and Tom very, very much for your lovely talks. I don't think clapping will work in this circumstance, so can I just ask you to do a wave as a thanks? Thank you very, very much indeed.